cars who lost their lives simply because they wanted to register to vote. The biggest push that Dr. King made for voter registration came in Selma, Alabama. Some of you may have seen foul footage of those 600 to 800 marchers who crossed that Edmonds Pettus Bridge and were attacked by state police on horseback wielding billy clubs, and other state police manning attack dogs, others manning high-pressure water hoses, fire hoses, and water cannons, beating out those marchers. They simply wanted to march down to the courthouse to register to vote. Dr. King said, if you want to allow us to march to the courthouse, we'll march to the State House. So they marched from Selma to Montgomery, more than 50 miles away. They started out with 600 to 800, but by the time they got to Montgomery, there were more than 15,000 marchers. One of the marchers was heard to ask the question, how long will it take? How long will prejudice blur the vision of men? Dr. King heard that question, but he didn't answer it until he was standing near the steps of the state capitol talking to the entire crowd. He told them that no matter how difficult the hour, no matter how frustrated the moment, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet behind that scaffold stands God within the shadows, keeping watch over his own. How long? Not long. That became their battle cry. And they marched on, and they marched until the following summer when the Voters' Rights Bill was passed. Dr. King and others were invited again to the White House to witness the signing of the Voters' Rights Bill. I said earlier that Dr. King was arrested numerous times for his activities, but he also received numerous death threats. And as you know, all of those threats were not idle threats. His home was bombed. He received as many as 24 threats per day on his life. Now, I know that doesn't compare to the nearly 400 per day that our current president received, but Dr. King did not have Secret Service protection. Someone once asked him, how is it that you're able to operate under these circumstances? He answered that question by telling this brief story. He said that he had been working with one of the steering committees and working late one night and didn't get home until around midnight. And he said, as soon as he crawled into bed, the telephone rang. And on the other end of the line was a very ugly voice. A voice that said, we're tired of your mess now. And if you aren't out of town within 3 days, we're going to blow up your home and kill your family. We're going to kill you. He said he hung up the phone, but he couldn't rest. He thought if he went to the kitchen and heated up some coffee, this coffee might help settle his nerves and allow him to get some rest. He said he sat there at that kitchen table. He thought about his loving and devoted wife who was in bed in the next room asleep, along with his daughter. He only had one child at that time, Yolanda. He called her Yoki. He thought about the fact that they could be taken away from him in an instant. He said he sat there at that kitchen table. He thought about his father, a very powerful man in Atlanta, but he was in Montgomery, more than 150 miles away. Couldn't call on his daddy. Couldn't call on his mama. He said he sat there at that kitchen table and he realized that it was time for him to call on his other father, the one that could make a way out of no way. He said he sat there at that kitchen table and he began to pray. And after a while, he began to pray out loud. And he said, as he prayed, he heard a voice that said, lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. And he said from that moment forward, he was never afraid of anything or anybody. That is why many believe he went on to Memphis. All of his advisors were saying, Martin, let's not go to Memphis. We're getting more threats out of Memphis than any other place we've ever decided to go. I opened my presentation with the words from one of his favorite songs, If I Could Help Somebody. That's how he lived his life. And that's part of the message that I leave with you here tonight, that you too try to help somebody so that your living won't be in vain. He went there to help those black sanitation workers who were on strike for better jobs and better working conditions. Now I know you may be saying in your own mind right now, what better job or better working condition could a sanitation worker want? Well, those black sanitation workers simply wanted to be able to drive the garbage truck. They weren't allowed to drive the garbage truck. It would mean a 10-cent per hour raise. Not only that, they weren't even allowed to sit in the cab of the truck. In fact, that's how the strike got started. You see, in the event of a storm, while they're collecting garbage, they weren't allowed to take shelter in certain neighborhoods, and they couldn't sit in the cab of the truck. Two sanitation workers crawled up in the back, where you throw the garbage, to take shelter. The operator forgot that they were in there, hit the button, and the gate came down and crushed them to death. That's how the strike got started. What better working condition did they want? After throwing garbage onto the truck all morning long, they simply wanted the right to wash their hands before eating lunch. They weren't allowed to wash their hands before eating lunch. The sign that they wore on the picket line simply read, "I am a man. I am a man." In other words, not an animal. Allow me to wash my hands before I eat. Dr. King went there to support those sanitation workers. He was scheduled to address them at a rally that night at the Masonic Hall. But as it would happen at about the time of the rally, a huge storm rolled through Memphis. A huge storm. Believing that no one would come out in this type of weather, Dr. King stayed back at the hotel. You see, he was working on his next March on Washington, the Poor People's March. He stayed back at the hotel. And instead of going over, he sent his companion, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, over to address whatever handful that might have shown up. When Dr. Abernathy walked into the hall, he saw a crowd that numbered more than 2,000 people. He sent word back to the hotel, "Dr. King, you better get over here. They're waiting for you." When Dr. King got there, he addressed that crowd, spoke for more than 45 minutes. He talked about his next March on Washington, the Poor People's March. Of course, he also talked about his support for those sanitation workers. He also talked about the war in Vietnam. As you know, he was against that war. Thought that money should be used here in America for the poor and other social programs. But many historians believe that he told us something else that night, that perhaps he knew that his time had come, that he would no longer be with us. And I would like to pick up just a portion of that speech, and I would like for you to decide whether you believe that he knew that his time had come. In that speech, he said, just a few years ago, I was in New York City, autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said, "Yes." The next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of it. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in a wheelchair in the hospital. And they allowed me to read some of the mail that came in. From all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president, but I forgot what those telegrams said. I had received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I forgot what that letter said. But there was another letter. It came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter and I'll never forget it.